In this week's Parsha, steht azoi vayidaber Hashem el Moshe medaber el Aharon v'amarto elav ba'aloisecho es haneros el mul pnei hamenoira yeiru shivas haneros. So Rashi says, as we all know, Lama Nismecha, Parshas Hamenoira, the Parshas Hanasim that appeared in the end of last week's Parsha, Lafi, Shekashero, Aaron, Chanukas Hanasim, Cholsho, Ozdaitoi, Sheloihoyo, Imohem, Bechanuka, Loihu v'loi Shiftoi, so he felt bad, he had Chalishu Sadas, Omalei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Chayecho, Shelcho Gdoilo Mishulahem, She'ato Madlik U'Meitiv Es Haneros. So you have even a greater role to play, and don't feel bad about the fact that you and your Shevet were not part of the Chanukas Hanasim. The Ramban says about this, V'loi nizbareli, the source of this is really in the Tanchuma, but the Ramban says, V'loi nizbareli, lama nichmoi ba'adlokas haneros, V'loi nichmoi b'ktoiras boike va'erev, sheshibcho yakosuf yosimu ktoira ba'apecha. So that seems to be something very special. Ubechola korbanos, that the Kohanim do all the avodas. Minchas chavitin, which is mincha that the Kohen Gadol brings every day. Uba'avodas Yom HaKippurim, she'eino kaporo elo boy, v'nichnas lefnai v'lefnim, v'shehu k'dosh Hashem, oimeid be'echoloi l'shorsoi, u'levorech b'shmoi, v'shivtoi kuloi, m'shorsei Elokeinu. So why is punkt the menorah, the nechama for Aharon and his shevet? So you know that in the beginning of Parshas Tetzaveh, the Torah says, "Va'ato tetzaveh es bnei Yisrael v'yikhu elecho shemen zayizoch." Now the Parshas of Truma and Tetzaveh are really about the binyan hamishkan and the making of the klei hamishkan and the big day kahuna. But Parshas Truma and Tetzaveh are not about the avodas that will be done in the Mishkan. That is reserved for Chumash Torah's Kohanim, for Chumash Vayikra. It doesn't say in Parshas Truma or Tetzaveh about the Hakravas Karbonis. And it doesn't say that we'll have to make soilus for the Menachos, or that we'll have to have kvosim for the tzmidim. So why is it that the Torah talks about making the shemen lamor, v'yikhu elecho shemen zayizoch kosis lamor? But not only that, the pasuk goes on and says, "Ba'oil moed michutz leparoiches asher alo edus yaroi choisei Aaron uvanov mi'erev ad boikel lefnei Hashem chukasam zeroisam me'ez b'nei Yisrael." So the pasuk not only tells us to create the shemen, but the pasuk talks about the actual lighting of the menorah. Whereas all avodas, we only learn in Chumash Vayikra, not in Parshas Truma and Tetzaveh. It's also interesting that the mitzvah of Adlokas Haneros does appear in Chumash Vayikra, in Parshas Amor, in the beginning of Kapitel Chav Daled. It says, "Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe leimer tzaves b'nei Yisrael v'yikhu elecho shemen zayizoch kosas lamor lahalis ne'etomid mechutz lebereiches ha'edus boil moed yarech ha'isei Aaron me'erev ad boikel lefnei Hashem tomid chukas on deresechem." Exactly the same pasuk as appears in Parshas Tetzaveh. So Rashi over there says, "Zu Parshas Mitzvahs Haneros." That if you're wondering, this is the Parsha of Mitzvahs Haneros. Uparshas va'ato tetzaveh lo nemro elo al seder meleches hamishkan lefarish tzorech hamenorah v'chein mashma va'ato soifcho letzavos es bnei Yisrael al kach. So Rashi is saying va'ato tetzaveh es bnei Yisrael means a day will come when you will be mitzaveh as bnei Yisrael, and that actually is what happens in Parshas Emor, where it says tzav es bnei Yisrael, because this is the parsha of mitzvahs haneros, and the fact that it appeared in Parshas Tetzaveh in the form of Ato Tetzaveh is lefarish tzorech hamenorah. That if you're wondering what is the menorah for, so the pasuk says soifcha letzaveh, he says bnei Yisrael al kach, to light the menorah. But this in itself, Avada, it needs a hesber. Why is it dafka the menorah that needed to be explained? What will be done with the menorah? I mean, the Torah did not explain in Parshas Truma Tetzaveh what will be done with the Mizbeach, what will be done with the Shulchan. And we left that for Chumash Vayikra. And why is it bedafke that the menorah needs to be explained? Lefarish tzorech ha-menorah al seder meleches ha-mishkan. So, the Ramban in Parshas Emor has another problem with Rashi. He says that if that was the reason that the Torah says va'ato tetzaveh, so the Torah should have explained the tzorech ha-menorah as soon as it told us to make the menorah. The tzivui on the making of the menorah is in the beginning of Parshas Truma. So if the reason that it says va'ato tetzaveh, soif chol tetzaveh is b'nei Yisrael al kach, is in order to lefaresh tzorech ha-menorah, it should have been said immediately after we got the tzivui to make the menorah. So why is it only after the entire Mishkan was discussed in Parshas Truma that in the beginning of Parshas Tetzaveh, the Torah tells us about what to do with the menorah? So it would be a talk, and that Reb Chaim says in the end of Hilchis, the Esmigdosh, that the Shittas HaRambam used to say it in a shorter than short. The Shittas HaRambam is that if the menorah was carried out, the Azor could do the Maisa Hadlaka, could light the menorah. And then the menorah is carried into the Heichel, and it's all good. The Rambam holds the Chatchila, Azor could be madlik the menorah in such a fashion. No, the Ravid says that it's a Mefurish Pasuk, Balois Chasaneros, that the Mitzvahs Hadlaka is Bekoyen. The truth is a Yalfusa that it's not puzzle if a Zor lit it, but the Mitzvahs Hadlaka is Bekoyen. Why does the Rambam seem to be saying that Lechatchila, a Zor could be madlik the menorah b'chutz? So Reb Chaim says that Avada Hadlakas HaMenorah is a mitzvah for the Kohen. However, if you madlik it b'chutz, that's not a Hadlaka b'chlal, because the mitzvah's hadlaka is not the hadlaka per se. The mitzvah's hadlaka is bringing about neiros dlukim in the heichel. That is the ma'isa hadlaka. The mitzvah's hadlaka is to create neiros dlukim in the heichel. That needs to be done by a kohen. But he says if it's lit b'chutz, so that is not a ma'isa hadlaka that requires a kohen, because it's not creating neiros dlukim in the heichel. Only when the neiros are carried into the heichel do they become neiros dlukim in the heichel. And therefore, the Rambam holds that l'chatchila a kohen could be madlik the neiros b'chutz. Reb Chaim is marich, and I'm not doing justice to his word. However, I just want to explain that we see from this that, in other words, the Hadlokas HaMenorah is not a avodah that takes place in the Mishkan, but the Hadlokas HaMenorah is really about having neiros dlukim in the Mishkan. What is that supposed to mean? This l'chara could be explained according to the chinuch in Mitzvah Tzadik Ches, where he says, Mishoroshei HaMitzvah, from the roots of the mitzvah of the menorah, shetzivanu Hashem Yisborach liyos ner doluk bebeis hamikdash lahagdolas habayis l'chavod u'leseferes be'enei haroyim, that an illuminated mikdash is kavod v'seferes be'enei haroyim. So he's actually saying that the mitzvah of Hadlokas HaMenorah, it's not an avodah that requires the mikdash in order for it to be performed, but it's vice versa. The Mishkan requires the neiros. And why does the Mishkan require the neiros? Because neiros, look, an illuminated Mishkan is a different level of Mishkan. It's l'chaved u'leseferes. The bias is a different level of bias. L'chaved u'leseferes b'nei haroyim. And Mamela Taka says over here that the mitzvah is to have neiros lukim. It's not the act of the hadlokah. Lefiza, we could understand that Dafka the menorah, the Torah tells us, Al Seder Meleches HaMishkon in Chumash Shemois, because the Adlokas Haneris is not stam an avoida, like it's not stam a mitzvah, like the Korbanos and the Lechem Aponim and other things that we do in the Mishkan, but it's actually part of what makes the Mishkan be the Mishkan that it ought to be. And it's shaykh to the Tzuras Habayis, and therefore it's in the Parshas of Meleches HaMishkan. And this also answers the Ramban's question that the Torah should have explained what will be done with the menorah as soon as it told us the mitzvah of making the menorah. That would be true if the reason that the Torah is telling us is in order that we shouldn't wonder what will we do with the menorah. But according to what we're saying, that the reason that it's being mentioned is like Rashi says, Al Seder Meleches HaMishkan. In other words, that it's telling me that the menorah will be lit in the Mishkan, because this is really the shleimus of the Mishkan, and that's why it appears in Chumash Shemois. So we understand that it's only after the entire Mishkan was discussed. That's the shpitz. That's what comes after the entire Mishkan was created, that we make it into an illuminated Mishkan, and that's the Va'ata Tetzaveh. Soivcha shetetzaveh es b'nei Yisrael al kach. And before we go on to discuss the Big Day Kahuna, after we finished in Parshas Truma discussing the Mishkan, the Torah tells us about what will be done with the menorah, that this will make the Hagdolas Habayis, the Chovidul Seferes. The Etzem Zachis Bemis Mefurish in the Bali Ataisis in Parshas Truma on the pasuk Shem and Lamor. The Bali Ataisis already asked Teime Shekol HaParsha B'Tzorchei Binyan Chutz Mi Pasuk Zeh Ve'eino Yomer Chitim L'Lechem Aponim U'Kvosim L'Tmidim V'Yashloimar Tzorech Binyan Hu Shekein Derech HaMalachim Lahadlik Ner Lefneim Kodim Sheyikonsu L'Bayis V'Aval Gav D'Lav L'Oira Hu Tzorech Rebbeinu Shalom doesn't need it Komokim Hu Kavod Shel Maila. And that's mamish what we're talking. Lefizeh, we could understand why the nechama for Aaron is dafke v'hadlokas haneros, and not all other avodas that the kohanim do and that the kohen gadol does, because he was upset. Sheloi hoya imohem loy hu v'loy shiftoi b'chanukah. So he wasn't part of the inauguration of the Mishkan, of the Avodas HaMishkan. So the nechama is that you will actually be the one that will inaugurate the Mishkan every day, because having said that the Neiro's Lukim is what makes the bias into a bias that's l'chavaydu l'seferes b'einei aroyim, come to choice that every time Aaron HaKohen is madlik, the Neiros, in the Mishkan, so he's be'emes being mechanech the Mishkan. Be'emes azoi state in the Rashbam, in the beginning of the Parsha, he says, Lefisha meleches todir, he zu, his kiroi kan. In the beginning of Parshas Behaloscha, Afal pi shekol meleches HaMishkan nigmera, meleches adlokas hamenorah loy nigmera, ki tedirohi. So what does that mean? The Afal pi shekol meleches HaMishkan nigmera, meleches hamenorah loy nigmera, ki tedirohi. What does it mean, meleches HaMishkan nigmera? All the avodas that we do in the Mishkan are not over. I mean, this is what we do on a daily basis in the Mishkan. We do all the avodas. But meleches HaMishkan nigmera, and this mitzvah of adlokas haderis is shaykh to the meleches HaMishkan. And this is the one malach of the Mishkan that wasn't nigmera. That wasn't nigmera. So, this malacha is an ongoing chinuch. It's an ongoing chinuch. It's interesting because we have a Gemara in Brachas Daf Nun Gimel that Gemara has a havam in it, that a moitzi shal heves mirishus hayochid l'rishus harabim on Shabbos shouldn't be over on meleches haitzah, because masha heiniach loy okar umasha okar loy heiniach, which means that an eish is always mischadesh. So therefore, it's appropriate that in the mitzvah of hadlokas hamenorah, we have we have an expression of the constant renewal, because just like the Eish constantly renews itself, so also by the Hadlakas HaMenorah, we have a daily chinuch. That was the Orach Chaim HaKodesh in this week's Parsha also says something very similar. He talks about the Machlokes Rishonim, if the Konim were kavua in the menorah, or the Konim were taken out b'shas the hatova and reset every day. And he takes the position, even though it's a machlokes in the Gemara, he takes the position that they were reset every day. And then he says, "Ukafi zeh naskil kavonas tshuvas Hashem la'aron, ki aharon hoya misaneach al chanukas hamizbeach, ve'yeshiva HaKadosh Baruch Hu chayecha shulcho g'doylo mishulahem, pirush ma'isa hamenorah, shemoirid haneros, umenicham ba'oyel, umekancham, v'choizer u'boyne oisa mechadesh u'matliko, harehu kol yom ka'oisa ma'isa chodesh, shemechanech hu asa menorah b'chol adloka v'adloka." He's not talking about the chinuch of the bayis, he's talking about the chinuch of the menorah, but he says that every day there's a new chinuch, and therefore this is, in particular, the nechama for Aharon. Now, we know that, like the Rambam says, that roiv mitzvahs ha-Torah are eitzos meirochoik, from the gdoil ha'etzav v'rav ha'aliluyo, for tikkun hadeyes v'yishur ha'maisim. We know that the v'osu li mikdosh v'shachanti b'soicham, they say that it's b'soicham, b'soichoi loy nemar, ela b'soicham, b'soich kol echad ve'echad, that every Yid has a mishkan within himself, b'lavavi, mishkan, evne, oyel, shikein, ba'odom. So there are all kind of avodas that a person does, all kind of ma'aseh mitzvahs that a person does, that he does inside his mishkan. But there's one thing that actually brings the entire mishkan to a different level, makes it into a bias that's l'kavod u'l'seferes be'enei haroyim, makes it into an illuminated bias, and that is be'emes the menorah. And in one's personal life, it's like it says, kiner mitzvah v'Torah or. In other words, the Torah is or, like we know that haroitze lahachkim, the Gemara says in Bava Basra, Daf Chof Hei, haroitze lahachkim yadrim, v'simnech menorah bedoron. So the menorah represents Chochmas HaTorah. Yeah, the Tziv has a big arichas in this week's Parsha about the difference between the Oren is Torah Shebeksav and the menorah is Torah Shebal Peh. But in any case, the menorah represents Chochmas HaTorah. So true Talmud Torah is one of the Tov Reish Yud Gimel mitzvahs. It's one of the Reish Mem Ches mitzvahs, I say. But Talmud Mevi Lidei Maaseh, Godel Talmud, we say, Godel Talmud Shemevi L'dei Maaseh. But it's not just because you have to learn in order that you should know the technicalities of the mitzvahs, that in order that you should be able to perform them. Because we say Godel Talmud Shemevi L'dei Maaseh, even if you're learning something that's not practical, even if you're learning Hilchos Mashiach, even if you're learning a Maida Hava Hava. So how is the Talmud Mevi L'dei Maaseh? It must be that it brings the whole person to a different level. And Memela, it imbues all his Maaseh HaMitzvahs with a different level of Dveikos, a different level of his Kashas to the Rebbeinu Shalom. So like the Rambam says, HaChocham Nikor, not only is Maaseh Mitzvahs, but HaChocham Nikor, Ba'achilosoi, Ubishtiyosoi, and in every activity that a person does, the Chocham is Nikor. In other words, he does it in an oifen of Chochmah, in an oifen of Torah. And therefore, the mitzvah of Talmud Torah is not just the mitzvah for itself, and it's not over with the Maisa Hadloka. It's the Nero's Dlukin. In other words, it's the fact that I have Torah or within myself that brings me to a different level. I'm a mela, all the mitzvahs, just like all the avodas that I've done in the Mishkan, are brought to a different level when the Mishkan is illuminated, and therefore they're happening in a Mishkan that's illuminated. So also through learning every day, a Yid illuminates his own Mishkan with the Or HaTorah, and Memela, all his Maisa mitzvahs are raised to a different level. El Mul Pnei HaMenorah, Ya'iru Shivas Haneres. There's different Mahalchim and how to read this pasuk. The Rashbam says, El Mul Pnei HaMenorah, Ya'iru Shivas Haneres, should be bending over to the side of Mul. And what was on the side of Mul? Mul HaMenorah was the Shulchan. The Rashbam says, El Mul Pnei HaMenorah, Ya'iru Shivas Haneres, means that the Neiros should be slanted towards the Shulchan. The Shulchan represents Oroitze Lahashir, Yatzpin, V'simnech, Menorah, Shulchan B'tzafon. So Shulchan really represents all a person's achilosai and shtiyosai and all his mundane activities. And that needs to be illuminated by the menorah that represents Torah. Because when a Yid learns Torah, not only his Maisa mitzvahs are brought to a different level, but all his Maisa are brought to a different level. And I'm going to leave you at that.